So you might be wondering, what is this mysterious spiderweb of images that is currently on screen? What if I told you that this represents something very significant in my life? What if I told you that each one of you in this room has something similar to this that lies within you? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Praveen Athauda Arachchi. I am 15 years old, and I am an experienced programmer and web developer. But it wasn't always that way. Let me take you through a story. Let's rewind far before where I am right now. I started out as a 6-year-old in a school in another country, where they introduced us to this app called Scratch Junior. The concept was very simple. You could connect blocks to program different characters to do things. And when I returned home, I begged my parents to let me use their iPad. And then from there onwards, I started making my first steps into the world of programming. Fast forward 2 years to when I was 8 years old, and I joined my current school, the British school in Colombo, where they introduced us to a more advanced version of the app called Scratch. The concept was the same, but there was a wide community centered around the app, and you could share your projects with the world. Unfortunately, mine never got much attention. But I got to making my first few games. I enjoyed making each one of my games, ranging from simple little platformers I suddenly came up with, to projects for school, and much more. For example, this was one of my first projects, which was a game where your controls were reversed, and you had to figure out how to move correctly and get through the levels. I even tried my hand at simple multiplayer games, even though not very many people ended up playing these. And then a few years later, I decided to submit one of my projects called One Life to a local game jam, which is a competition where you're supposed to make a game in a small period of time, sometimes according to a theme. And in my age category, I won. This was a massive confidence boost for a 10-year-old me at the time. As the years went on, I slowly transitioned away from Scratch and into my first serious programming language, which was Python. And at the beginning, I was only able to create things using text, which I found quite boring at the time. But then I learned to use a game library for Python. And my passion for making games continued, this time in a new programming language. And this was during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was difficult for everyone. But one advantage was that I had virtually unlimited free time. And then I remember my parents seeing these games and telling me, why don't you make an educational game instead? You could teach people maths, programming, science, and much more. So like the typical 12-year-old that I was, I decided to fulfill their request, but in the smallest way possible, by making exactly one educational game. It was called COVID Exterminator. It was a game about made to spread awareness about good hygiene habits during the COVID pandemic. And it was slightly fun to play. And I tried releasing this onto the Microsoft Store. And unfortunately, it didn't gain much attention, only getting around 50 players. Thanks to the 50 people who decided to play my game, despite the very simple gameplay and the lack of quality. But as I continued broadening my scope in programming, I started to realize that I really had a passion for this, and that I really enjoyed being able to tell the computer exactly what I wanted it to do and having it do that right in front of my eyes. So then a few more years passed, and me and my friend found out about this competition called the Uber Global Hackathon. It was a competition where you were supposed to create a practical project that addressed one of the issues in your community. And thus, Farmerfine was born. we made it to the Asian regional finals of the competition. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get into the next round, which was the global finals. However, we realized that we really could implement this in Sri Lanka. Oh, I'm so sorry. This app was addressing the issue of during the fuel crisis. It was difficult for people to travel to pharmacies and find their medicines, which is why we decided to submit this project. And we realized it could be implemented in Sri Lanka. So we decided to submit this project to the NMRA. After a few improvements, we decided to submit it to the NMRA, which is the National Medicines Regulatory Authority of Sri Lanka. And we presented our project, but unfortunately, we weren't able to take it in the direction that we wanted it to. Despite this, I learned a few crucial things about projects, one of which being managing the practical side of projects, another being how to mitigate the difficulty in promoting your project, and a third one about web development in general, since this was my first website. But however, while developing this, I found out about another issue with medicines in Sri Lanka, which was that the NMRA, again, was responsible for licensing and registering all of these medicines, yet they were urgently in need of a web application which could search through all of the registered medicines in Sri Lanka. And from there, my second practical project was born, which was called MediVerify. And I'm thankful to say that this project ended up being launched at the NMRA's 9th anniversary and was officially released. These are a few photos of our official release. And the project gathered attention beyond my imagination. It was even incorporated onto official national websites. However, now I think it's time we went back to the web I showed you at the very beginning. While these projects aren't my end goal, and I still have a long way to go before I reach that goal, I noticed something interesting while developing my serious projects. I noticed that before I developed these serious projects, I set out tiny targets for myself to develop small games and more. And these tiny targets ended up not being as insignificant as I thought they were. So when I started out with Scratch Junior, my projects were very, very, very basic, and they were only shown to myself. But these projects taught me the basic programming fundamentals that I needed to branch out to my projects in Scratch. And each game that I made in Scratch taught me more about how to perfect my scripts for the movement of the player, for transitioning through levels, and more. But then once I decided to move into real programming, I noticed that instead of being overwhelmed with complicated lines of text, which the code was made up of, I found a way to translate from the blocks that I was used to into the text-based programming that I had, that became more and more natural to me the more I decided to use Python. And then my passion for games led me to learning a game library in Python. Then my next project taught me how to structure my code correctly, which was very important for my first practical project, which taught me the skills I mentioned earlier. And improving this practical project taught me more about web design and how to make your websites look good. And finally, it all led to my most recent project, where it actually ended up being released. However, in the beginning, you might notice there's one more sneaky arrow that goes all the way from the very beginning to the very end, to my most recent project. And why is that? It's because of a very specific reason, actually. In the beginning, when I was using Scratch Junior, my projects, there was a lot of limitations. And you weren't able to make your characters do any complex actions unless you used one technique, which was running multiple scripts at the same time. And this really helped me with my most recent project where I had multiple different program files and had to get them to work in sync with each other. However, most of you in this room probably aren't programmers. You guys would have your own passions and your own goals that you want to achieve. And for example, you might be a musician. You would have started out by playing simple melodies or playing simple songs that were only for your own ears to enjoy. You may want to become an artist, but you would start out by creating simple paintings and by creating like small drawings that you would only share with yourself and your close family or friends. You might be an athlete, where you would start out by participating in small school competitions, for example, where your talent isn't necessarily shared with the world in the beginning. However, remember that in my example, each of these tiny targets I set for myself ended up forming this interconnected tapestry of goals, where one goal led to another, and in the end, this tapestry is what made me who I am now. When you create your goals, this tapestry of this tapestry of experience is what ends up forming your skill. And it isn't until your tapestry or your web of experience reaches a certain size that your talent finally starts to get recognized by the world. For example, for me, it was only my most recent project that gained a noticeable amount of attention. So the main takeaway is, no matter how small these targets may be, they may be something like simple, small games that you decided to make and didn't expect many people to acknowledge. No matter how small these targets are, as long as these targets end up growing the web of your skill in some way, even a small way, in the end, one day, you will be able to achieve your goal and share it with the world, potentially even making other people's lives better in the process. Before I leave, I would like to thank the heads of my school, Mrs. Hannah Wells and Mr. Nick Hardcastle, as well as my teacher, Mr. Tisra Fernando, and the organizers of TEDxYouth at Gateway College Negombo for giving me this opportunity to talk to you today. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, even though my small projects alone never accounted for anything because they weren't released and they weren't shared with the world or finished, in the end, I found out that the tiny targets connected to make something much larger, which is the tapestry of experience that lies within each of us.